Part 1. The Call and the Gathering Storm. The summer of 1198 brought with it an air of expectation that rippled through the great halls and monasteries of Western Christendom. Pope Innocent III, barely 37 years old and possessed of an ambition that matched his youth, had ascended to the throne of St. Peter with a singular vision burning in his mind, the reconquest of Jerusalem. The Holy City had fallen to Saladin 11 years prior, and though the Third Crusade had achieved modest gains, the jewel of Christianity remained in Muslim hands, a wound that festered in the conscience of every pious soul from Rome to the Rhine. Innocent was not a man content with half measures. Where his predecessors had relied upon the spontaneous fervor of princes and kings, he would organize, systematize, and direct a crusade with the precision of a master strategist. In August of that year, he dispatched letters across Europe, his words crafted with the careful art of persuasion that would define his papacy. The tax of 1/40 was to be levied upon all church income for the Crusades' funding. Indulgences were promised, full remission of sins for those who took up the cross. The machinery of salvation itself was being retooled for war. But kings, those essential instruments of past crusades, proved disappointingly unavailable. Philip II of France was locked in a bitter struggle with King John of England over continental territories. The German Empire writhed in the chaos of succession disputes, following the death of Henry VI. The great monarchs who might have led this venture were occupied with their own earthly kingdoms, leaving Innocent's grand design to find champions among the lesser nobility. It was in a tournament field in Champagne, in November 1199, that the crusade found its voice. Count Thibaut III of Champagne, 22 years old and hungry for glory, was hosting a gathering of knights when a Cistercian monk named Fulk of Neuilly rose to preach. Fulk was no ordinary cleric. He had spent years as an itinerant preacher, his sermons combining apocalyptic fervor with earthy humor, speaking to peasants and nobles alike in terms they could grasp. His face, weathered by years of travel, bore the intensity of absolute conviction. "Brothers!" Fulk's voice carried across the assembled knights, many still flushed from their martial contests. "While you joust for ribbons and ladies' favors, the tomb of our Lord lies trampled beneath infidel feet. What glory is there in mock combat when real battles call? What honor in games when the greatest gain, the salvation of your immortal souls, awaits in the East?" The crowd stirred. These were men raised on stories of the First Crusade, of Godfrey of Bouillon and the miraculous conquest of Jerusalem a century past. They knew the songs of Roland and the tales of Charlemagne. War was their profession, but war sanctified, war that promised both earthly renown and heavenly reward. This was irresistible. Count Thibaut was the first to step forward. Young, vigorous, with the wealth of Champagne behind him, he knelt before Fulk and received the cross, a simple cloth symbol sewn onto his shoulder, marking him as a soldier of Christ. Within moments, others followed. Count Louis of Blois, Thibaut's cousin, took the cross. Count Baldwin of Flanders, ruler of one of Europe's wealthiest territories, made his vow. Simon de Montfort, a knight whose name would later become synonymous with brutal religious warfare, pledged himself to the cause. The movement spread like wildfire through the networks of feudal obligation and family connection. By the end of 1199, thousands had taken the cross. These were not the massive peasant armies of previous crusades, but hardened warriors, professional fighting men who brought with them squires, servants, and the complex logistics of medieval warfare. Each knight might represent a small retinue of 20 or 30 souls, craftsmen, cooks, grooms, and men-at-arms. Yet, even as the crosses were distributed and oaths sworn, practical realities began to intrude upon spiritual enthusiasm. Count Thibaut established his headquarters at Troyes and summoned the other leaders to plan their campaign. They gathered in February 1200, in a great hall warmed by roaring fires against the winter cold, and faced their first crucial decision: how would they reach Jerusalem? The disasters of the Second Crusade, which had seen vast armies perish crossing Anatolia, loomed large in memory. The overland route through hostile Byzantine and Turkish territory had proven treacherous. The sea route, though expensive, offered speed and safety. But the Crusaders possessed no fleet, and building one would take years they did not have. It was then that 6 envoys were chosen to negotiate passage with the maritime powers of Italy. Among them was Geoffrey of Villehardouin, Marshal of Champagne, a man in his middle years whose sharp mind and gift for observation would later preserve this entire tale for posterity. With him went Conon of Bethune, a knight poet whose verses had entertained courts across France, and 4 others of similar standing. The envoys departed in February 1200, carrying with them the authority to negotiate on behalf of the Crusades' leadership. Their instructions were clear: secure transport for an army of 33,500 men, 4,500 knights, 9,000 squires, and 20,000 foot soldiers, along with 4,500 horses. The numbers themselves revealed the ambition of the enterprise. This was to be no raiding party, but a fully equipped invasion force. They rode south through the Alpine passes as winter began to loosen its grip, their small party dwarfed by the mountains rising around them. Each carried letters of credentials sealed with the marks of the Crusades' leaders, and each understood the weight of their mission. The future of the Crusade, the liberation of Jerusalem itself, rested upon their ability to strike a bargain with merchants and sailors whose primary concern was not salvation, but profit. As they descended into Italy, Geoffrey of Villehardouin might have reflected on the irony of their position. They were warriors, trained to settle disputes with lance and sword, now transformed into diplomats who would haggle over prices and tonnage. Yet this was the new reality of crusading in the 13th century. The age of miraculous victories won by divine intervention alone had passed. Now, crusades required contracts, payment schedules, and the cooperation of men whose faith in God was equaled by their faith in gold. The envoys would visit Genoa first, that republic of merchants and sailors perched on the Ligurian coast. Part 2: The Bargain of Venice. Genoa disappointed them almost immediately. The republic's merchants, calculating and cautious, listened to the envoy's proposal with expressions that revealed nothing. They quoted prices that seemed designed more to discourage than to negotiate. Their shipyards were committed to other ventures, they explained. The timeline was too tight. The numbers too ambitious. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, watching the Genoese officials exchange knowing glances, understood that they were being politely dismissed. Genoa had no interest in gambling its resources on a crusade led by counts rather than kings. The rejection stung, but the envoys pressed on. They rode down the coast to Pisa, where they received a warmer welcome but ultimately the same answer. The Pisans were embroiled in their endless rivalry with Genoa and lacked the capacity to outfit such a massive expedition on short notice. By late March 1200, as spring brought new life to the Italian countryside, the envoys found themselves with dwindling options and growing desperation. Venice remained, La Serenissima, the most serene republic, the greatest maritime power in the Mediterranean. If any city could transport the Crusader army, it was Venice. But Venice was also the most expensive, the most demanding, and the most shrewd in its negotiations. The Endes knew they were approaching a city that treated war and commerce as indistinguishable enterprises. They arrived in early April, their horses' hooves clattering on the wooden bridges that connected Venice's 100 islands. The city rose from the lagoon like a miracle of human defiance against nature, marble palaces reflected in green waters, the golden domes of San Marco gleaming in the spring sunlight, the campanile towering over the piazza like a declaration of earthly power. This was a city built entirely on trade, where every stone had been imported, where fresh water arrived by boat, where wealth flowed through the Rialto market in rivers of gold and silk and spices from the east. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, received them in the ducal palace. He was, by any measure, an extraordinary figure. Contemporary sources disagree on his exact age. Some claim he was in his 80s, others put him past 90. What all agreed upon was that he was nearly blind, his eyes having been damaged decades earlier under circumstances that remained disputed. Some whispered it happened during a brawl in Constantinople, others claimed a blow to the head in a street fight. Dandolo himself never spoke of it. But blindness had not diminished the Doge's capacity for leadership. His mind remained sharp as Damascene steel, his memory encyclopedic, his will absolute. He had been elected Doge in 1192 after a career as a diplomat and trader, and he had guided Venice through 8 years of prosperity and expansion. Now, at an age when most men were long dead or drooling in their chairs, Enrico Dandolo was about to negotiate the most consequential deal of his life. The initial audience was ceremonial. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, kneeling before the Doge's throne, presented the Crusaders' request with all the eloquence he could muster. They sought transport for God's army, passage to Egypt, for the strategic thinking had evolved. Jerusalem would be conquered by first striking at Cairo, the heart of Ayyubid power. They came as soldiers of Christ, but they came ready to pay fair price for fair service. Dandolo listened, his damaged eyes staring at something beyond the physical room. When Geoffrey finished, the Doge spoke in a voice still strong despite his years. "The matter you propose is weighty. Venice does not make such decisions in haste. You will have our answer in good time. Meanwhile, you are guests of the Republic." What followed was a masterclass in negotiation. For weeks, the envoys cooled their heels in Venice while Dandolo consulted with his advisors, with the merchant guilds, with the shipwrights and the sailors' fraternities. Venice was not an absolute monarchy where the Doge's word was law. It was a republic where power flowed through complex channels of councils and committees. Every major decision required consensus among the city's commercial elite. During this waiting period, the envoys were treated to displays of Venetian wealth and power that were clearly calculated to impress and intimidate. They were shown the arsenal, Venice's massive shipyard where galleys were constructed with assembly line efficiency unmatched anywhere in Europe. They watched as workers moved in orchestrated precision, each team responsible for specific tasks, one group fitting ribs, another caulking seams, another installing benches for the oarsmen. A galley could be completed in a single day if necessary. The arsenal could produce a war fleet in months. They were taken to the warehouses at the Rialto where goods from 3 continents were stored: pepper from India, silk from China, furs from Russia, amber from the Baltic. They saw the mint where Venice's silver grosso, the most trusted currency in Mediterranean trade, was stamped. The message was clear: Venice had the resources, the expertise, and the infrastructure to transport an army anywhere. The question was whether the price would be acceptable. In early May, Dandolo summoned the envoys for serious negotiation. The meeting took place in a council chamber, with Venetian officials arrayed behind the Doge. Dandolo spoke without notes, his blind eyes directed toward the envoys as if he could still see them. "We have considered your proposal. Venice is willing to build and provision a fleet sufficient for your needs. We will transport 4,500 knights and their horses, 9,000 squires, and 20,000 foot soldiers. We will provide food for 9 months for all these men and fodder for the horses." Geoffrey leaned forward. This was more than they had dared hope, not just transport, but provisions as well. "The price," Dandolo continued, "is 85,000 marks of Cologne silver." The sum was staggering. A mark of silver was roughly 8 ounces. 85,000 marks represented over 28 tons of pure silver. It was more wealth than most kingdoms possessed. Geoffrey and his fellow envoys exchanged glances. They had been authorized to negotiate, but this exceeded anything they had anticipated. Dandolo was not finished. "Furthermore, Venice will provide 50 fully armed war galleys at our own expense, manned by our own crews. These galleys will accompany your expedition and fight beside you. In return, Venice asks only that we share equally in all conquests. Half of all lands and spoils taken will belong to the Republic." It was an audacious proposal. Venice was offering to become a full partner in the crusade, contributing military force at its own expense in exchange for half of whatever empire the Crusaders carved out. For a city-state built on trade, this represented a massive gamble and a departure from Venice's usual calculated caution. The envoys requested time to deliberate. They withdrew to their lodgings, a palazzo overlooking the Grand Canal, and argued late into the night. The price was enormous. Could the Crusaders possibly raise such a sum? Yet the alternative was to abandon the entire enterprise. Without ships, there would be no crusade. Without Venice, there would be no ships. Conan of Bethune, the poet-knight, put the dilemma into words. "We came here with authority to make a deal, not to return home empty-handed. If we refuse Venice, where else can we turn? Genoa and Pisa have already declined. We either accept Dandolo's terms or watch the crusade dissolve before it begins." The next morning, they accepted. The formal treaty was drawn up in Latin and Venetian dialect, specifying every detail: the types of ships, horse transports, troop carriers, supply vessels, the dates of departure, the payment schedule. The 85,000 marks would be paid in installments, with the final sum due before the fleet sailed. The contract was to be sealed and ratified by both parties. But a problem remained. The envoys had no authority to bind the crusade to such enormous debt on their own recognition. The treaty required formal approval from the crusade's leadership. Geoffrey and his companions prepared to return to France, carrying with them the most expensive contract any crusading expedition had ever signed. Before they departed, Dandolo arranged one final display. On a Sunday in early June, the envoys were brought to the Basilica of San Marco for High Massachusetts. The church blazed with mosaics, golden tesserae catching candlelight, creating the illusion that heaven itself had descended into this earthly space. After the service, Dandolo addressed the assembled Venetians, thousands packed into the basilica and the piazza outside. "People of Venice!" His voice, amplified by the church's acoustics, reached every ear. These men come to us seeking aid in God's work. They ask us to build a fleet such as has never been seen, to transport an army to deliver Jerusalem from bondage. Venice has always been the shield of Christendom against the infidel. Will we fail now when we are called to this holy purpose? The response was thunderous. No! We will not fail! For God and San Marco! Dandolo raised his hands for silence. Then let us swear before God and the relics of the blessed evangelist Mark that Venice will fulfill this contract. We will build the ships. We will provide the provisions. We will sail with these warriors to victory or death. The crowd erupted again. The Endes, watching this orchestrated display of civic unity, understood they were witnessing political theater of the highest order. Dandolo had just committed Venice publicly, making it a matter of the Republic's honor. There could be no backing out now, not for Venice, and not for the Crusaders. Geoffrey of Villehardouin rode north through the summer heat with the sealed treaty in his saddlebags, knowing he carried either the salvation or the doom of the Fourth Crusade. The contract was signed, but the truly difficult part, raising 85,000 marks of silver from an army that had not yet fully assembled, still lay ahead. As the towers of Venice disappeared behind him, he permitted himself a moment of doubt. Had they made a bargain with partners, or had they sold themselves into servitude to the most calculating merchants in Christendom? History would provide the answer, but not in any way that Geoffrey could have imagined as he crossed back over the Alps toward France, where news of the Venetian treaty would soon spread through the Crusader camps, bringing hope to some and apprehension to others. Part 3. The Gathering at Venice and the Debt. The news of the Venetian treaty spread through the Crusader camps of France and the Low Countries with the speed of wildfire and dry grass. 85,000 marks of silver, the sum was repeated in great halls and monastery cloisters, in market squares and along pilgrim routes, sometimes with pride at the scale of the enterprise, more often with growing unease. It worked out to approximately 2 marks per fighting man, a fortune that assumed every single crusader who had taken the cross would honor his vow and contribute his share. But crusading armies, as veterans knew too well, never assembled as planned. The summer of 1200 brought the first omen of trouble. Count Thibaut of Champagne, the young nobleman whose enthusiasm had sparked the entire enterprise, fell gravely ill. By May 1201, he was dead at 24, his dreams of glory extinguished by fever. The crusade lost not just a leader but a crucial financial pillar. Champagne's wealth had been expected to anchor the payment to Venice. The Crusader barons met hastily to choose a replacement. They needed someone with military experience, political standing, and, critically, access to money. Their choice fell upon Marquis Boniface of Montferrat, a northern Italian nobleman whose family had deep crusading credentials. Boniface's father had died on the Second Crusade. His brother had been king of Jerusalem until Saladin's conquest. Now in his 50s, Boniface brought experience and connections, particularly with the Italian states. He accepted the leadership, and immediately began the work of organizing the scattered Crusader contingents for the journey to Venice. Throughout 1201 and into 1202, Crusaders made their way toward the assembly point. They traveled in groups ranging from a handful of knights to contingents of several hundred men. The roads of Europe filled with armed pilgrims, for that is what they were, pilgrims bearing weapons, their white crosses sewn prominently on surcoats and cloaks. They carried what wealth they possessed in coin, plate, jewelry, anything that could be converted to silver to pay their share of the Venetian passage. Venice, meanwhile, had kept its side of the bargain with a efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. Enrico Dandolo had mobilized the entire productive capacity of the Republic toward crusade preparation. The arsenal worked day and night. The forests of the Dalmatian coast, Venice's timber reserve, were harvested for ship timber. Foundries produced anchors and fittings. Sailmakers stitched vast expanses of canvas. Coopers built thousands of barrels for water and provisions. Bakers prepared ship's biscuit, the twice-baked hardtack that could last for months at sea. By the summer of 1202, Venice had constructed a fleet that stood as one of the engineering marvels of the medieval world, 50 war galleys as promised, plus transports capable of carrying the entire contracted army with their horses and equipment. The ships represented an investment of approximately 65,000 marks of Venice's own money, a staggering commitment that had required the Republic to redirect resources from its normal trading ventures. Venetian merchants had foregone profitable voyages to Syria and Egypt so that ships and crews would be available for the crusade. The deadline was set. The Crusaders were to assemble at Venice by the end of June 1202, with the fleet scheduled to sail in early autumn to avoid winter storms. As June arrived, Boniface of Montferrat and the advance contingents began arriving at the Lido, the barrier island that protected Venice's lagoon from the Adriatic Sea. The Venetians had prepared an encampment there, the island of San Nicolo di Lido, where the Crusaders would gather away from the city itself. Venice had no intention of allowing thousands of armed foreigners to camp within its streets. Geoffrey of Villehardouin arrived in June and watched the Crusaders stream in day by day. There were the Flemish under Count Baldwin, disciplined troops from one of Europe's wealthiest regions. The men of Champagne and Blois came under their respective counts, bearing the arms and armor that French metalworkers had spent months crafting. Knights from Burgundy, Picardy, and the German lands appeared with their retinues. Each new arrival was counted, registered, and assigned space in the growing camp. But even as the numbers grew, it became horrifyingly apparent that they would fall short. By the end of July, when the bulk of arrivals had ceased, Geoffrey and the other leaders conducted a careful census. They had perhaps 12,000 men total, roughly one-third of the 33,500 they had contracted for. The reasons for the shortfall were many. Some Crusaders had died in the intervening 2 years. Others had lost their enthusiasm or spent their funds. Many had chosen alternative routes to the Holy Land. Why pay the Venetian passage fee when one could sail more cheaply from other ports, or even attempt the overland journey? This last group particularly galled the Crusades' organizers. While they had been negotiating with Venice and building toward this great fleet, other Crusaders had made independent arrangements. Some had departed from Marseilles. Others sailed from southern Italian ports controlled by various Norman and Hohenstaufen lords. These men would still technically be Crusaders, but they had abandoned the unified army, and, critically, they had taken their money with them. The financial mathematics were brutal. With only 12,000 men present, even if every single one contributed his full 2-mark share, they could raise only 24,000 marks. They owed Venice 85,000 marks. The deficit was 61,000 marks, over 2 tons of silver that simply did not exist in the Crusader camp. Boniface of Montferrat called a council of the leadership on the Lido in early August. The meeting took place in a pavilion that offered scant protection from the summer heat. Around the table sat the counts and barons who bore responsibility for this catastrophe: Baldwin of Flanders, Louis of Blois, Hugh of St. Pol, Geoffrey of Villehardouin himself. They faced a crisis that threatened to destroy the crusade before a single blow had been struck against the infidel. "We must approach the Doge," Boniface said heavily. "We must explain our situation and seek accommodation." "Accommodation?" Count Baldwin's face flushed red. "We signed a contract. Venice has fulfilled its obligations. We must somehow fulfill ours." "With what?" Louis of Blois gestured helplessly. "We've collected everything the men possess. I've contributed my own treasury. We're still 61,000 marks short. We cannot conjure silver from air." Geoffrey of Villehardouin, ever the pragmatist, posed the question they all dreaded. "What will Venice do if we cannot pay?" The answer came soon enough. In mid-August, Enrico Dandolo crossed from Venice to the Lido to meet with the Crusader leadership. The Doge arrived in his official barge, rowed by liveried oarsmen, accompanied by a contingent of Venetian officials and guards. He was helped ashore, his great age and blindness requiring assistance, but once on solid ground, his bearing was that of a man fully in command. The meeting was conducted with formal courtesy that barely masked the tension. Boniface explained the situation honestly. They had approximately 34,000 marks silver to tender. The shortfall was regrettable but unavoidable given circumstances beyond their control. Dandolo listened in silence, his blind eyes directed toward the speakers. When Boniface finished, the Doge spoke with chilling precision. "The contract specified 85,000 marks for transport of 33,500 men. You have brought fewer than half that number, yet you expect Venice to provide the full fleet at one-third the agreed price?" "We asked for understanding," Boniface began. "Understanding?" Dandolo's voice, though aged, carried acid. "Venice has spent the past 2 years building this fleet at enormous expense. We have foregone trading voyages worth fortunes. We have mobilized our entire arsenal for this enterprise. Our ships sit idle in the lagoon, their crews unpaid, while we wait for an army that has failed to materialize. Now you speak of understanding?" The Venetian officials murmured agreement. One of them, a merchant named Domenico, spoke up. "The contract is clear. 85,000 marks, or Venice keeps the fleet, and you crusaders can swim to Egypt." Dandolo raised a hand for silence. "Domenico speaks harshly, but he speaks truth. Venice has fulfilled every obligation. You have not. By law and custom, the contract is void and you forfeit any payments already made." The Crusader leaders exchanged desperate glances. To forfeit the 34,000 marks they had already collected would be ruinous. More importantly, without the fleet, there could be no crusade. Years of preparation, thousands of vows, the hopes of Christendom, all would collapse into failure and humiliation. "Great Doge," Geoffrey of Villehardouin spoke carefully. "What would you have us do? We cannot produce silver we do not possess. Yet we remain committed to the crusade, to the liberation of Jerusalem. Surely some arrangement can be reached?" Dandolo was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted subtly. "There may be a way forward. But it will require the crusade to render certain services to Venice first. Services that will offset the debt you have incurred." This was the moment when the Fourth Crusade's fate pivoted. The nature of those services would reshape not just the expedition but the entire political landscape of the Mediterranean world. But Dandolo would not reveal his proposal immediately. He was too skilled a negotiator for that. Consider your position, the Doge continued. You are camped on the Lido with no means to depart. The summer campaigning season slips away. Soon the autumn storms will make sailing impossible, and you will spend winter here, consuming supplies you cannot pay for, your army dissolving through desertion and disease. Venice, meanwhile, has a fleet rotting and used and enormous debts of our own to address. We have mutual interests in finding a solution. What solution do you propose? Boniface asked, though something in his voice suggested he already feared the answer. I will present a proposal to my councils, Dandolo said. If they approve, I will bring it before your entire army for their consent. This matter is too weighty for private negotiations between leaders. Let the common soldiers hear Venice's terms and decide whether they find them acceptable. With that, Dandolo departed, leaving the Crusader leadership to contemplate their predicament. They were trapped, financially obligated to Venice, militarily dependent on Venetian ships, politically weakened by their failure to raise the contracted army. Whatever terms Dandolo proposed, they would have little choice but to accept. Geoffrey of Villehardouin walked along the Lido beach that evening, watching the sun set over the Adriatic. The fleet bobbed at anchor in the lagoon behind him, hundreds of vessels, the product of Venice's industrial might, all ready to sail anywhere in the known world. But they would not sail for free, and the price Venice was about to demand would stain this crusade with a controversy that would echo through the centuries. In his Chronicle, written years later, Geoffrey would defend the decisions made in these desperate days. But even he, ever the loyal apologist for the Crusades' leadership, could not entirely disguise the sense that in signing the Venetian contract, the Crusaders had made a bargain they could not control, with a partner who would bend the entire enterprise toward Venice's own purposes. The crusade that was supposed to liberate Jerusalem was about to take a very different direction. Part 4. The Diversion to Zara. September arrived with cooler winds and the growing desperation of men trapped by circumstance. The Crusader camp on the Lido had taken on the atmosphere of a prison. Supplies dwindled. The Venetians, having calculated precisely how much food their contracted 33,500 men would consume, had provisioned accordingly. Now, with only 12,000 Crusaders present, the mathematics should have worked in the army's favor. Fewer mouths meant supplies would last longer. But Venice, ever meticulous in its accounting, reduced provisions proportionally to the reduced payment received. The Crusaders found themselves on strict rationing. Worse than hunger was the psychological burden. These men had taken holy vows, had left homes and families, had spent their fortunes on equipment and passage. They had come to fight for Christ, to wash away their sins in the sacred cause of Jerusalem's liberation. Instead, they sat idle on a sandbar, their great enterprise stalled before it had begun, reduced to debtors begging terms from merchant princes. Desertions began in earnest. Groups of knights and soldiers, disgusted by the delays and seeing no path forward, slipped away in the night. Some made their way to other ports, hoping to find independent passage to the Holy Land. Others simply went home. Each departure weakened the army further and deepened the financial hole. Fewer men meant even less ability to pay the Venetian debt. It was in this context of growing crisis that Enrico Dandolo made his move. In late September, he summoned both the Crusader leadership and representatives from all contingents to a great assembly in the Church of San Marco. The choice of venue was deliberate, conducting the meeting in Venice's most sacred space, beneath the golden mosaics, and before the supposed bones of Saint Mark himself, would lend divine sanction to whatever proposal the Doge intended to make. The Crusaders were ferried across from the Lido in Venetian boats. They crowded into San Marco, filling the nave and aisles, their armor and weapons creating a discordant martial presence in this space designed for worship. Venetian citizens packed the galleries and the piazza outside. Whatever was about to transpire, Dandolo intended it to be witnessed by all. The Doge entered slowly, guided by attendants, and took his position before the high altar. Despite his blindness and advanced age, he commanded the space with presence that owed nothing to physical sight. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the basilica. "Crusaders of Christ," he began, "you have come to Venice seeking passage to the Holy Land. Venice has prepared that passage at great expense. Yet you find yourselves unable to fulfill the terms of our agreement. This places both our peoples in difficult circumstances." He paused, letting the weight of the situation settle over his audience. "However, Venice is not without mercy. We recognize that your intentions are holy, even if your resources have proven insufficient. Therefore, I come before you with a proposal that may serve both our interests and the greater cause of Christendom." The Crusaders leaned forward. Here, finally, was the solution they desperately needed. "There is a city," Dandolo continued, "which was once part of Venice's rightful domain but has been seized by the King of Hungary in defiance of all law and treaty. This city is Zara, on the Dalmatian coast. It was built with Venetian money, settled by Venetian colonists, and prospered under Venetian protection. Yet it has rebelled and placed itself under Hungarian sovereignty, denying Venice the trade rights and revenues that are lawfully ours." Geoffrey of Villehardouin, standing among the Crusader nobles, felt his stomach tighten. He could see where this was leading. "Venice proposes this accommodation," the Doge said. "Help us recapture Zara, restore it to Venetian control, and we will postpone payment of your debt until such time as you have taken spoils from the infidel. The fleet will sail to Zara, you will assist in its conquest, and then we will proceed together to Egypt as originally planned. This delay of mere weeks will cost you nothing but allows Venice to recover a valuable asset that has been unjustly stolen." The proposal hung in the air of the basilica like incense smoke. On its surface, it seemed reasonable, a brief detour to settle a local dispute, after which the crusade would proceed as planned. But several of the more astute crusaders immediately grasped the problems. First, Zara was a Christian city. The Crusaders had taken vows to fight Muslims, not fellow Christians. Attacking Zara would be a direct violation of their crusading oaths. Second, Zara was under the protection of King Emmerich of Hungary, who had himself taken the cross and was, at least nominally, a crusader. Attacking the territory of a fellow crusader was doubly problematic. Third, and this was understood by those with political sophistication, once the crusade diverted to Zara, there was no guarantee it would ever reach Egypt. Each deviation from the original plan would make it easier to justify subsequent deviations. A Cistercian abbot named Guy stood up, his face flushed with anger. "This is an abomination. We took the cross to fight the enemies of Christ, not to serve as mercenaries for Venetian commercial interests. Zara is a Christian city under Crusader protection. To attack it would be a sin that would damn our souls, not save them." Murmurs of agreement rippled through sections of the army. But Dandolo was prepared for objections. "Zara has rebelled against lawful authority," he countered. "It has broken oaths and treaties. It has allied with Hungary against Venice, disrupting the peace of Christendom. Is it not also a crusader's duty to restore justice and punish oath breakers? Moreover, and here his voice hardened, let us speak plainly. Without Venice's fleet you go nowhere. You have no means to reach the Holy Land. You can remain here on the Lido, consuming your dwindling supplies until winter forces you to disband in shame. Or you can accept this reasonable accommodation, settle a just dispute, and continue to your ultimate objective with Venice as your willing partner. Boniface of Montferrat rose to speak. As the Crusades' supreme commander, his position carried weight. Great Doge, might we have time to deliberate among ourselves on this proposal? Of course, Dandolo said smoothly. Discuss, debate, pray for guidance. But know that Venice has been patient long enough. We require your answer within 3 days. If you cannot agree to these terms, then our contract is void and you must make alternative arrangements for your crusade, if alternative arrangements exist, which I doubt. The Crusaders withdrew from San Marco in turmoil. That evening and through the following days, the camp on the Lido became a theater of fierce argument. The army divided roughly into 3 factions. The first faction, led by pragmatists like Geoffrey of Villehardouin and many of the senior nobles, argued for acceptance. They saw no alternative. Without Venetian ships, the crusade was dead. Zara was a brief detour, a small price to pay for keeping the entire enterprise alive. Once Zara was taken and the debt postponed, they could proceed to Egypt and fulfill their true mission. The second faction, smaller but vociferous, rejected the proposal utterly. These were men like Abbot Guy and Simon de Montfort, who would later lead the vicious Albigensian crusade, suggesting his objection was based on principle rather than squeamishness about violence. They argued that attacking Christians, regardless of political justification, violated their crusading vows. To assault Zara would be to forfeit the spiritual benefits they had taken the cross to gain. Better to disband and go home with souls intact than to proceed with souls stained by unchristian warfare. The third faction, probably the largest, was composed of ordinary soldiers who simply wanted to be told what to do. They had followed their lords to Venice, had taken the cross because their social superiors had done so, and would follow whatever course the leadership determined. These men were not theologians or strategists. They were warriors who wanted to fight someone and didn't much care who, as long as it was sanctioned by authority. The debate reached a crisis point when a papal legate arrived in the camp. Pope Innocent III, learning of the Crusaders' difficulties, had sent Cardinal Peter Capuano to provide spiritual guidance. The cardinal brought letters from the Pope explicitly forbidding any attack on Christian lands. Innocent had gotten wind of the Venetian proposal and moved to prevent exactly this sort of diversion. Cardinal Peter read the Pope's letter before an assembly of crusaders. We absolutely forbid that any crusader should attack or invade Christian lands unless those lands unjustly impede the Crusade's passage or there is some other compelling reason approved by the Apostolic See. Anyone who violates this prohibition shall be subject to excommunication. The threat was clear and carried weight. Excommunication meant more than social ostracism. It meant damnation. Eternal separation from God's grace. For men who had taken the cross precisely to secure their salvation, this was a devastating prospect. But Dandolo was not deterred. When informed of the papal letter, he responded with a counter-argument that demonstrated his skill at canonical interpretation. The Pope forbids attacking Christians without compelling reason, he noted. But there is compelling reason. Zara's rebellion threatens the stability of the Adriatic, which is essential for Crusader passage. Moreover, Hungary's seizure of Venetian territory is itself unjust. We do not defy papal authority. We fulfill the Pope's own criteria for justified intervention. More crucially, Dandolo made a practical point that swayed many wavering crusaders. The Pope is in Rome. You are here. He commands you not to attack Zara, but he offers no alternative. Does he provide ships? Does he forgive your debt? Does he suggest how you might reach Jerusalem without Venetian assistance? No. He issues prohibitions without solutions. Venice offers solutions. The 3-day deadline arrived. Boniface of Montferrat called the final council. After hours of debate, a vote was taken among the leadership. The result was close, but the pragmatists won. The crusade would accept Venice's terms and proceed to Zara. Simon de Montfort, and those who absolutely refused to participate in attacking Christians were given permission to leave. They departed the Lido in disgust, making their own way toward the Holy Land. Their departure further weakened the army but removed the most vocal opposition. Cardinal Peter Capuano found himself in an impossible position. He could excommunicate the entire crusade, thereby destroying it completely, or he could acquiesce. After much anguished prayer, he chose a middle path. He would accompany the crusade to Zara but would not explicitly sanction the attack. His presence might at least provide some moral restraint and opportunity for repentance. With the decision made, the mood in the camp shifted. The paralysis of indecision gave way to the relief of action, however problematic. Men began preparing for departure with renewed energy. Weapons were sharpened, armor repaired, supplies loaded. Then Enrico Dandolo made an announcement that shocked Crusaders and Venetians alike. He personally would take the cross and join the crusade. On a Sunday in early October 1202, the ancient Doge, blind and in his 80s or 90s, stood before a crowd in San Marco and swore the Crusaders' oath. The white cross was sewn onto his distinctive corno ducale, the ducal cap that symbolized his office. The gesture was politically brilliant. By becoming a crusader himself, Dandolo aligned his interests completely with the expedition. He would share its dangers and its glories. Venice's Doge would not simply send the crusaders forth with hired ships. He would lead them personally. The implications were staggering. This was unprecedented in Venetian history, and it bound the crusade and Venice together in ways that went far beyond any contract. But it also meant that Venice's influence over the crusade's direction would be enormous. Dandolo would not be merely a transport contractor but an active participant in all strategic decisions. Where he led Venice's 50 war galleys, the crusade would follow. The fleet departed Venice in early October 1202, one of the greatest armadas medieval Europe had ever assembled. Over 200 vessels filled the lagoon, transports, war galleys, supply ships, their sails bearing the Lion of St. Mark. On board were approximately 12,000 crusaders and perhaps 10,000 Venetian sailors, marines, and oarsmen. Enrico Dandolo stood on the deck of his flagship, the Doge's Vermilion Galley, as the fleet rowed out into the Adriatic. They sailed south along the Dalmatian coast, that rugged shoreline of mountains plunging into crystalline waters. After several days' voyage, the fleet arrived before Zara in mid-November. The city rose before them on its peninsula, surrounded by strong walls built decades earlier with Venetian engineering expertise. Ironically, the Crusaders would now have to overcome fortifications that Venice itself had constructed. Zara's citizens, watching the massive fleet anchor offshore, understood immediately that their situation was hopeless. The city sent envoys to negotiate surrender, but Dandolo's terms were absolute, unconditional submission to Venetian authority. The city's leaders, hoping for rescue from King Emmerich of Hungary, refused and shut the gates. The siege began. The Crusaders established camps outside the walls while Venetian engineers erected siege machinery. Mangonels and trebuchets were assembled, massive timber frames that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds against the fortifications. Siege towers were constructed, mobile structures that would allow attackers to reach the height of the walls. But before the first stone was cast, a dramatic intervention occurred. Messengers arrived from Pope Innocent III bearing new letters. The Pope, learning that the crusade had actually proceeded toward Zara despite his prohibition, issued an explicit and unambiguous command. Any crusader who participated in the assault on Zara would be immediately excommunicated. There were no caveats, no room for interpretation. Cardinal Peter Capuano read the letter publicly in the Crusader camp. The army fell silent. Excommunication was not a threat to be taken lightly. Yet they had come so far, had committed so deeply to this course. Turning back now would mean admitting complete failure and returning to Europe in disgrace. Dandolo's response was characteristically bold. He announced that Venice would assault Zara with or without Crusader participation. If the Crusaders wished to honor the Pope's command, they could remain in camp while Venetian forces alone took the city. However, Dandolo noted, this would mean the Crusaders contributed nothing to offsetting their debt, and Venice's willingness to postpone payment would naturally be reconsidered. The Crusader leadership found themselves checkmated. They huddled in Boniface's tent, the autumn wind howling outside, and faced their second impossible choice in as many months. Geoffrey of Villehardouin argued that they had already come too far to turn back. Count Baldwin countered that eternal damnation was too high a price for any earthly objective. In the end, fear of immediate practical consequences outweighed fear of spiritual ones. The Crusaders would participate in the assault. They would deal with the Pope's anger afterward, seeking absolution once the deed was done. It was a gamble with their immortal souls, but these were men accustomed to gambling with their mortal lives. The assault on Zara lasted 5 days. The siege engines battered the walls while sappers dug tunnels to undermine the foundations. The city's defenders fought courageously, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. On November 24, 1202, with sections of wall collapsed and Venetian troops pouring through breaches, Zara's leaders sued for peace. The city surrendered unconditionally. Venetian officials took possession of the government buildings and began reasserting the Republic's authority. The Crusaders, meanwhile, settled into the city for the winter. November was too late in the season to continue sailing. The autumn storms made further progress impossible until spring. As the Crusaders distributed themselves through Zara's houses and churches for winter quarters, Geoffrey of Villehardouin reflected on how far they had strayed from their original purpose. They had come to liberate Jerusalem, and instead they had spent their first military action conquering a Christian city on behalf of Venetian commercial interests. They were excommunicated Crusaders, a contradiction that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Yet Geoffrey and others clung to the belief that this was merely a detour. Come spring, they would sail for Egypt, strike at the heart of Muslim power, and redeem themselves through the conquest of Jerusalem. The Zara episode would be forgotten, a minor footnote to ultimate triumph. They could not have been more wrong. The diversions had only begun, and the next would take the crusade not to Egypt but to the greatest Christian city in the world, Constantinople itself. Part 5: Constantinople and the Ultimate Betrayal. Winter in Zara passed uneasily. The Crusaders and Venetians, crammed into a city that resented their presence, fell into quarrels that occasionally erupted into violence. Fights broke out between French and Venetian soldiers over lodgings, over women, over perceived slights. On one occasion, a brawl escalated into a full-scale street battle that left several men dead before the leaders could restore order. The expedition that was supposed to unite Christendom against the infidel was instead turning Christian swords against each other. More troubling was the spiritual crisis. The Crusaders had defied the Pope and stood excommunicated. Cardinal Peter Capiano had departed in disgust, returning to Rome to report on the disaster. Priests in the army heard confessions and said masses, but the sacraments performed by excommunicated men carried questionable validity. Some soldiers, their consciences tormented, slipped away from Zara and made their way home or to other ports. The army that had landed at Zara with 12,000 men would emerge in spring with perhaps 10,000. It was during this troubled winter that envoys arrived who would redirect the crusade toward its most infamous chapter. They came from Germany, representatives of a young man named Alexios Angelos, who styled himself the rightful emperor of Byzantium. His story was one of palace intrigue, betrayal, and exile, a tale that would prove irresistible to an army desperately seeking both purpose and profit. The Byzantine Empire, that ancient continuation of Rome in the East, had fallen into dynastic chaos. In 1195, Emperor Isaac II Angelos had been overthrown by his own brother, who seized power, blinded Isaac, and imprisoned him. The usurper crowned himself as Alexios III. Isaac's son, young Alexios, had escaped and fled to the west, seeking allies who might restore his father to the throne. He had found a willing listener in Philip of Swabia, King of Germany, who happened to be married to young Alexios's sister. Philip had pointed his desperate brother-in-law toward the Crusader army wintering in Zara. Young Alexios's envoys presented their proposal to Boniface of Montferrat and Enrico Dandolo in January 1203. Their prince, they explained, was the legitimate heir to the Byzantine throne. His uncle Alexios III was a usurper who had seized power through the most heinous of crimes, overthrowing and blinding his own brother, the Lord's anointed emperor. If the Crusaders would help restore young Alexios to his rightful throne, the prince promised extraordinary rewards. The proposed terms were staggering: 200,000 silver marks to be paid to the crusade, more than double what they owed Venice. The Byzantine Empire would submit to papal authority, ending the centuries-old schism between the Orthodox and Catholic churches. The empire would provide 10,000 troops to accompany the crusade to Egypt, plus supplies for an entire year. Finally, young Alexios would maintain 500 Byzantine knights in the Holy Land permanently, at his own expense, to defend any conquests the crusade achieved. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, listening to these promises, recognized them as almost certainly fantasy. The Byzantine treasury was not so flush that 200,000 marks could be produced on command. The Orthodox Church, proud and ancient, would never submit to Rome merely because a prince desperate for his throne commanded it. The envoys were making promises their principal might not be able to keep. But the alternative was to admit the crusade had failed completely. They would emerge from Zara still excommunicated, still in debt to Venice, with no funds and no clear path to Egypt or Jerusalem. Young Alexios's proposal, however dubious, offered a way forward. It offered wealth to pay their debts, Byzantine military support for the Egyptian campaign, and, critically, it could be framed as a just cause. They would not be mercenaries but righteous warriors restoring a legitimate Christian emperor to his throne, punishing a usurper, and reuniting the Church. The debate in the Crusader camp was fierce and revealed the expedition's deepening moral rot. The same arguments that had been deployed to justify Zara were now trotted out to justify Constantinople. Dandolo, unsurprisingly, supported the proposal enthusiastically. Venice had its own reasons for wanting a friendly regime in Constantinople. The current Emperor Alexios III had been hostile to Venetian commercial interests in the city. But significant opposition emerged. Many crusaders were simply exhausted by the constant diversions. They had been promised Egypt and Jerusalem, and instead they had spent months in the Adriatic conquering Zara. Now they were being asked to sail to Constantinople, a city that was not even on the way to the Holy Land. Some knights began to openly question whether those leading the crusade had any intention of ever reaching Jerusalem. A contingent led by Reynold of Montreal announced they would not participate in any attack on Constantinople. They demanded ships to carry them to Syria, where they would join other crusaders already fighting in the Holy Land. Similar groups formed, each insisting on being released from the expedition. The crusade was dissolving. Boniface of Montferrat faced the real possibility that his army would fragment completely. In desperation, he and the other leaders literally threw themselves at the feet of potential deserters, begging them to remain. Geoffrey of Villehardouin describes scenes of nobles weeping, pleading that if the army divided now, the crusade would fail entirely and all their sacrifices would be for nothing. The emotional appeals worked barely. Most of the dissenters agreed to remain until at least September 1203, after the Constantinople venture was completed. If the expedition had not proceeded to Egypt by then, they would be free to depart. It was a compromise that kept the army together but set a deadline that would later prove significant. In April 1203, as spring made sailing feasible again, the Crusader fleet departed Zara. Young Alexios Angelos himself had joined them, a prince in his early 20s who carried himself with the confidence of youth but who had never actually governed anything. He stood on deck beside Boniface and Dandolo, watching the Dalmatian coast recede, perhaps contemplating whether he was being delivered to his throne or to his doom. The fleet sailed east across the Aegean, stopping at various islands to resupply. At Corfu, there was another crisis when a large group of crusaders attempted to desert en masse, demanding to be transported to Syria immediately. Again, the leaders had to plead, argue, and cajole. The army was held together by increasingly frayed threads of obligation and desperation. By late June 1203, the fleet approached Constantinople, and even hardened crusaders who had seen the great cities of Europe found themselves awestruck. Constantinople was simply unlike anything in the West. Its triple walls, constructed by Emperor Theodosius nearly 800 years earlier, stretched for miles, studded with towers and gates. The city held perhaps 400,000 inhabitants, larger than any Western city. The Hagia Sophia, with its massive dome, dominated the skyline like a mountain of marble and gold. Palaces, churches, monuments, and the famous hippodrome spoke to 1,000 years of continuous civilization. Geoffrey of Villehardouin wrote, "I can assure you that those who had never seen Constantinople before gazed upon it with wonder, for they could not believe there could be in the world so magnificent a place. They noted the high walls and the mighty towers that enclosed it all around, the rich palaces and lofty churches, so many that no one would have believed it who had not seen it with his own eyes. But the Crusaders had not come as tourists. They anchored their fleet in the Bosphorus, and sent young Alexios into the city to claim his throne. They expected, or at least hoped, that the Byzantine populace would welcome their rightful prince and overthrow the usurper Alexios III. The Byzantines did no such thing. To them, young Alexios was not a legitimate claimant but a puppet of the hated Latins, the Western Europeans whom the Orthodox Greeks viewed with a mixture of contempt and suspicion. The schism between Eastern and Western Christianity ran deep, nourished by centuries of theological disputes, cultural differences, and political conflicts. The fact that this prince arrived with an army of Catholics was not a point in his favor but a mark of his unsuitability. Emperor Alexios III, the usurper, initially tried to negotiate. He offered the Crusaders money to go away, not the enormous sums young Alexios had promised, but enough to be tempting. Dandolo rejected the offer. Venice had invested too much in young Alexios's restoration to accept a mere payoff. The Crusaders therefore proceeded to demonstrate their military might. In early July, they launched an assault on the seawalls along the Golden Horn, the harbor that cut into the city's northern side. Venetian galleys, their crews expertly trained, maneuvered close to shore. The Crusaders had rigged their ships with flying bridges, long planks that could be extended from the ship's masts to the top of the seawalls, allowing soldiers to storm directly from ship to wall. The attack was spectacular and terrifying. Enrico Dandolo, ancient and blind, stood in the prow of the Venetian flagship urging his men forward. According to Geoffrey's account, Dandolo threatened his rowers that if they did not beach the ship directly beneath the walls, he would personally have them executed. Whether this is literal truth or propaganda, the Venetian assault succeeded. Troops poured from the ships onto the walls, overwhelming the defenders through sheer audacity. Simultaneously, the Crusader knights attacked one of the land gates. These Western warriors, armored in steel plate from head to foot and mounted on massive destrier warhorses, were qualitatively superior to Byzantine troops who relied on lighter armor and more mobile tactics. The gate was breached after fierce fighting. The military pressure worked. On the night of July 17 to 18, 1203, Emperor Alexios III lost his nerve. Realizing he could not defend the city against determined Crusader assault, he fled. He simply abandoned his throne, gathered what portable wealth he could carry, and escaped into Thrace with a small retinue. His departure created a power vacuum. The Byzantine aristocracy, desperate to avoid a sack of the city, released the blind ex-emperor Isaac II from prison and restored him to the throne. His son, young Alexios, was crowned as co-emperor, Alexios IV. The Crusaders had achieved their objective without even occupying the city. Constantinople had a new government, one that owed its power entirely to the Latin army camped outside the walls. Young Alexios IV now had to make good on his extravagant promises. This proved impossible almost immediately. When he announced that Byzantium would submit to Rome and began collecting the 200,000 marks he had promised, the Byzantine populace erupted in fury. Riots broke out. Orthodox priests denounced the emperor as a traitor to the true faith. The Byzantine treasury, already depleted by Alexios III's corruption and flight, could not produce anything like 200,000 marks. Alexios IV managed to scrape together about 100,000 marks by confiscating church property, melting down sacred vessels, and imposing new taxes. This partial payment only deepened Byzantine hatred of their new emperor and his Latin supporters. The Crusaders, meanwhile, grew impatient. They had installed this emperor specifically to obtain his promised rewards. Where was the rest of the money? Where were the troops for Egypt? When would the Orthodox Church formally submit to Rome? The situation deteriorated through the fall and winter of 1203 to 1204. The Crusaders remained camped outside Constantinople, their presence a constant irritant. Small conflicts erupted into larger ones. In August, a group of Flemish crusaders started a fire in a Muslim quarter of the city. Constantinople, as a cosmopolitan trade center, had neighborhoods of various religions. The fire spread and burned for 3 days, destroying hundreds of acres in the city center. Thousands of Latins living in Constantinople fled to the Crusader camp, fearing Byzantine retribution. Emperor Alexios IV found himself trapped between his Latin sponsors, who demanded he fulfill his promises, and his Byzantine subjects, who demanded he expel the Latins. He tried to satisfy both and succeeded with neither. He pleaded with the Crusaders for more time to raise funds. He promised his people that the Latins would leave soon. His credibility eroded daily. In February 1204, Byzantine tolerance reached its breaking point. A court official named Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Mortsuflos, for his bushy eyebrows, organized a palace coup. In a midnight confrontation, Mortsuflos arrested the young Emperor Alexios IV. Within days, Alexios IV was dead, strangled with a bowstring, the Byzantine method for disposing of inconvenient royalty. His father Isaac too died simultaneously, whether from shock, poison, or convenience remains unclear. Mortsuflos crowned himself Emperor Alexios V and immediately took a hard line against the Latins. Emperor Alexios V sent envoys to the Crusader camp with a blunt message: all agreements made by Alexios IV were void. The Crusaders would receive no more money. They would leave Byzantine territory immediately or face the empire's full military might. For the Crusader leadership, this represented both a crisis and an opportunity. The crisis was obvious. They had no money, no path forward, and were now in hostile territory. The opportunity was less immediately apparent, but ultimately more significant. Alexios V had committed regicide and usurpation. The Crusaders could cast themselves not as aggressors but as avengers of a murdered Christian emperor. A council was convened in March 1204 that included Crusader nobles, Venetian officials, and clergy. They faced a stark choice: retreat in failure or attack Constantinople itself. The arguments for attack were by now familiar. They were owed money that only Constantinople's wealth could pay. The current emperor was a murderer and usurper. The Byzantines had proven themselves treacherous and hostile to the crusade. Moreover, and here the religious justification reached its cynical peak, conquering Constantinople would bring the Orthodox Church under papal authority, healing the schism and strengthening Christendom. The clerics present should have rejected this reasoning. Attacking the greatest Christian city in the world violated every principle of crusading. But these clerics had already rationalized Zara. They had already excommunicated themselves and been partially absolved. One more moral compromise seemed almost trivial by comparison. They gave their approval. Constantinople could be attacked as a just war against schismatics and usurpers. On April 9, 1204, the Crusader fleet launched its assault on Constantinople's seawalls. The attack was a nightmare of fire, blood, and desperate courage on both sides. Byzantine defenders poured Greek fire, the empire's secret weapon, a petroleum-based incendiary that burned even on water, onto the attacking ships. Crusaders fell screaming into the harbor, engulfed in flames that could not be extinguished. But the Venetian sailors, skilled and fearless, pressed forward. The attack on April 9th was repulsed with heavy casualties. The Crusaders retreated to their camps, discouraged and wondering if Constantinople might prove impregnable after all. But Dandolo and Boniface rallied the army. On April 12th, they attacked again, concentrating their forces on a section of seawall near the Blicherni Palace. This time, they succeeded. A Venetian ship called the Pilgrim and another called the Paradise managed to get their flying bridges onto the towers. A handful of men, fewer than 10, scrambled across those swaying planks high above the harbor and secured a foothold on the walls. More men followed. A gate was opened from inside. Suddenly, Crusaders were pouring into the city. Emperor Alexios V, commanding the defense personally, attempted to rally his troops. But Byzantine morale collapsed. The sight of Western knights in full armor, unstoppable juggernauts of steel and horseflesh, broke the defenders' will. Alexios V fled, becoming the second Byzantine emperor in a year to abandon Constantinople rather than defend it to the death. By nightfall on April 12th, the Crusaders controlled Constantinople. And then began one of the most notorious episodes in medieval history, the sack of Constantinople. For 3 days, the Crusaders and Venetians looted the richest city in Christendom. The violence was systematic and comprehensive. Churches were stripped of their treasures, gold and silver vessels, jeweled icons, precious relics. The Crusaders had come seeking salvation, and instead became thieves desecrating the holiest shrines of Eastern Christianity. The famous bronze horses from the Hippodrome were carted off to Venice, where they still stand on San Marco's facade. The Shroud of Turin, the Crown of Thorns, fragments of the True Cross, relics beyond price were stolen and distributed across Western Europe. The violence against persons was equally terrible. Women were raped, including nuns torn from convents. The elderly were beaten and robbed. Citizens who resisted were killed. The Crusaders, frustrated by months of delay and false promises, vented their rage on an innocent population. Byzantine chroniclers, writing years later with undimmed horror, compared the Latins to demons, claiming that even the Muslim Saracens were more merciful to Christian cities than these supposed fellow Christians had been. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, in his Chronicle, glosses over the worst atrocities. He notes that much booty was taken, and admits there was disorder, but claims the situation was quickly brought under control. Other sources, particularly Byzantine accounts, paint a far darker picture of massacre and sacrilege. When the looting finally ended, the Crusaders divided their spoils according to a prearranged agreement, half to the Crusaders, half to Venice. The total value was estimated at 400,000 silver marks, an enormous fortune that would have funded multiple crusades to the Holy Land. Instead, it was divided among men who had violated every principle they had sworn to uphold. From the ruins of the Byzantine Empire, the Crusaders created their own regime, the Latin Empire of Constantinople. Count Baldwin of Flanders was elected as the first Latin emperor. Boniface of Montferrat received the kingdom of Thessalonica as compensation. Venetian officials took control of key ports and islands, building the maritime empire that would make Venice a Mediterranean superpower for centuries. The crusade that had set out to liberate Jerusalem ended not in the Holy Land but enthroned in Constantinople. A few crusaders, their consciences troubled, used their portion of the loot to hire ships to Syria and continued to the Holy Land independently. The majority stayed in Constantinople or returned to Europe, considering their crusading vows fulfilled by the conquest of the Byzantine capital. Pope Innocent III, when news of Constantinople's fall reached Rome, initially reacted with horror. He had explicitly forbidden attacks on Christian cities. He had excommunicated the Crusaders for Zara. Now they had committed an even greater crime, sacking the second city of Christendom and murdering Orthodox Christians by the thousands. But Innocent was also a pragmatist. The deed was done. The Orthodox Church, which had resisted papal authority for centuries, was now under Latin control. The schism appeared to be ended, albeit through violence rather than reconciliation. After his initial outrage cooled, Innocent rationalized the outcome as God's mysterious providence. Perhaps the fall of Constantinople, however regrettable in its methods, served a divine purpose by uniting the Church under Rome. He was wrong, of course. The Orthodox faithful never accepted Latin rule. The hatred generated by the sack of 1204 poisoned East-West Christian relations for centuries and arguably contributed to the Byzantine Empire's eventual collapse to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The Crusaders had not strengthened Christendom, but irreparably weakened it. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, writing his Chronicle years later as an old man, still defended the Fourth Crusade's leaders. Every diversion, every moral compromise, had been necessary and justified by circumstances, he insisted. They had been trapped by events beyond their control, making the best decisions possible under impossible conditions. History has judged otherwise. The Fourth Crusade stands as a cautionary tale of how noble intentions can be corrupted by pride, greed, and rationalization. Men who set out to serve God ended up serving themselves. A holy war became a political conquest. The crusade that was meant to unite Christians against Muslims instead turned Christian against Christian in history's most infamous act of religious fratricide. Enrico Dandolo died in Constantinople in 1205, in his 90s, having achieved Venice's greatest triumph. He was buried in the Hagia Sophia, a final indignity to the Orthodox faithful who had venerated that church for 7 centuries. Count Baldwin, the Latin emperor, survived less than a year before being captured and killed by Bulgarian forces in 1205. The Latin Empire itself lasted only 57 years. In 1261, Byzantine forces recaptured Constantinople and restored Greek rule. But the city never recovered its former glory. The sack of 1204 had destroyed too much, scattered too many treasures, killed too many citizens. When the Ottomans finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, they were toppling an empire already hollowed out by the Crusaders' greed 2.5 centuries earlier. Jerusalem, the ostensible objective of the Fourth Crusade, remained in Muslim hands. Not one crusader from this expedition ever set foot in the Holy City as a liberator. The irony was complete. An army sworn to free Christ's tomb never came within 1,500 miles of it, instead spending their strength conquering and despoiling the greatest Christian city in the world. The Fourth Crusade began with Pope Innocent III's soaring vision of Christian unity and triumph. It ended with Christians slaughtering Christians, sacred relics stolen for profit, and Christendom divided against itself more deeply than ever. If the road to hell is paved with good intentions, then the Fourth Crusade constructed a highway.